You begin with a confidence that appears natural, the sense that what you know is grounded in truth simply because it feels coherent. You rely on the mind as if its clarity were identical with accuracy. Yet Al-Ghazali raises the first challenge within this comfort. He asks whether coherence guarantees truth, or whether it merely reflects the mind agreeing with itself. This interrupts the confidence you usually place in your judgments. You start to notice that the mind evaluates truth using the very structure that produces those evaluations. The judge and the judge are the same. Once this circularity appears, the stability of your certainty weakens. If certainty depends on the mind's approval, what confirms the mind? Al-Ghazali lived in 11th century Baghdad, a place defined by intense intellectual activity. Philosophers examined existence through strict reasoning. Theologians defended doctrine through formal argument. Jurists refined systems of law with disciplined logic. Mystics sought inward clarity through deliberate inner work. Each group claimed access to truth. Amid these competing voices, Al-Ghazali recognized that brilliance alone did not produce certainty. Intellectual achievement created complexity, but it did not resolve the deepest questions. If every discipline claimed authority yet reached different conclusions, what standard decides among them? As Al-Ghazali examined the major disciplines of his time, he encountered their limits. Philosophical reasoning produced elegant systems, yet those systems often contradicted one another. Theological arguments defended inherited beliefs, but they depended on premises that were themselves untested. Jurisprudence offered precision, but its conclusions varied depending on the interpretive method. He realized that the mind tends to validate ideas that align with its expectations and dismiss those that do not. This raised a troubling possibility that certainty might be nothing more than the mind reinforcing its own preferences. If the mind can deceive itself while believing it is correct, what qualifies as knowledge? You typically trust reason because it appears to move in clear steps, from premise to conclusion, from question to answer. Yet Al-Ghazali invites you to notice how rarely you examine the premises themselves. You accept them because they seem obvious, but their obviousness may come from habit rather than truth. Reason depends on these underlying assumptions about perception, memory, and inference. If these foundations are unstable, the arguments built upon them lose their authority. You begin to see that the conviction you place in logical conclusions is tied to the untested certainty you grant to their premises. This is not an argument against reason. It is a recognition that reason inherits the vulnerabilities of whatever it starts with. The clarity you feel does not necessarily arise from truth. It may arise from the mind confirming its own starting points. If every argument depends on assumptions, who verifies the assumptions? Al-Ghazali turned next to the senses. They appear reliable because they present information directly, without interpretation. Yet he noticed how easily they contradict one another. What you hear may not match what you see. What appears consistent at one moment may shift in another. Even familiar experiences can be misleading under different conditions. If the senses falter in simple observations, how can they validate complex claims about reality? The intellect depends on sensory data, but the data itself is uncertain. When the foundation is unstable, the structure cannot be solid. You begin to understand why Al-Ghazali refused to treat observation as the final arbiter of truth. The senses can guide practical life, but they cannot establish certainty. If perception is unstable, can knowledge built on perception ever be final? After questioning the senses, Al-Ghazali turned toward intellect itself. Intellect appears more refined than perception. It operates with abstraction, analysis, and precision. Yet it too has limits. It constructs systems that are internally coherent but not necessarily true. What seems rational depends on the assumptions the intellect accepts without question. You trust your reasoning because it feels orderly, not because it has proven itself from outside its own structure. And this is the heart of Al-Ghazali's insight. Intellect cannot step outside itself to confirm its reliability. It evaluates truth using tools that it cannot test independently. This does not invalidate intellect. Rather, it reveals its domain. Intellect can clarify, compare, analyze, and infer. But it cannot provide certainty about the deepest questions because it cannot verify its own source of authority. In recognizing this, you begin to see how much of your confidence rests on the smooth functioning of a process whose foundations you cannot inspect from beyond itself. If intellect is the tool you use to judge truth, how do you judge the tool? Faced with the limitations of the senses and the intellect, Al-Ghazali did not turn toward despair. Instead, he considered the possibility that certainty arises from a level of awareness that does not depend on argument. He suggested that there may be a mode of knowing in which truth becomes evident without needing to be proven. This mode is not emotional and not instinctive. It does not replace reason, it clarifies it. It is a form of insight in which doubt recedes not because a conclusion has been defended, but because the structure of the mind becomes transparent. Al-Ghazali called this level illumination, not in a metaphorical sense, but as a precise state in which the mind recognizes truth directly rather than constructing it through inference. You may not yet know what this state means, but you begin to see that knowing and reasoning are not the same. Reason leads to precision, but insight leads to certainty. If truth does not emerge from reasoning, how does it reveal itself? You now move inward, following Al-Ghazali's shift from analysis to self-examination. He observed that the mind's clarity is shaped not only by its reasoning but also by its internal condition. Bias, pride, fear, and attachment distort perception long before reasoning begins. These distortions influence what you accept as true and what you reject as false. If the mind is clouded, no argument, no matter how coherent, can produce certainty. The argument will be interpreted through whatever biases remain unexamined. This is why Al-Ghazali saw purification of the self as essential to the pursuit of knowledge. This purification is not asceticism or withdrawal. It is the disciplined act of observing how the self interferes with truth. When you notice how desire shapes judgment, the desire loses its influence. When you see how fear directs reasoning, fear weakens. When you recognize how attachment narrows perception, attachment dissolves. As these distortions fade, the mind becomes capable of recognizing truth without forcing it into pre-existing frameworks. What remains is not a new argument but a mind made transparent to itself. If the self shapes every judgment, how do you see truth without the self shaping it? After a long inquiry, Al-Ghazali reached a stage where doubt no longer undermined him. This was not because he had solved every intellectual problem. Instead, he saw that doubt loses its power when the mind stops mistaking its own habits for truth. Certainty arises not from accumulating arguments, but from removing the distortions that cloud understanding. You begin to sense what this means. Doubt becomes a mirror rather than a threat. It shows you the limits of your current understanding. It reveals where the self is attached to an idea. It exposes where fear prevents deeper inquiry. In this state, doubt no longer demands immediate resolution. Instead, it guides you toward the conditions in which truth becomes visible. When the mind no longer defends its assumptions, It becomes open to recognizing what is real rather than what is comfortable. This is why certainty cannot be forced. It arrives when the mind is quiet enough to perceive without distortion. It is not created by thought. It is discovered when thought stops insisting on its own conclusions. If certainty is not created by thought, how does it arise within thought? As the inquiry deepens, you realize that the final barrier is not ignorance but the one who claims to know. The self that seeks truth also wants to possess it. It wants truth to confirm its preferences, reinforce its identity, or satisfy its desire for control. Al-Ghazali teaches that this possessive impulse obscures understanding. When the self tries to dominate truth, it creates resistance. When the self lets go, clarity becomes possible. You begin to see that seeking is necessary, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, seeking becomes interference. The seeker must dissolve, not through force, but through recognition that the self cannot own truth. Truth does not belong to the intellect or the will. It appears when the mind no longer imposes itself. If the seeker lets go of seeking, what remains to find truth? When the self releases its claim over truth, understanding takes on a different quality. It is not something gained or achieved, it is something recognized. The mind becomes aware without asserting itself. This awareness has no owner because it is not produced by effort. It arises naturally when interference ends. Al-Ghazali describes this state as clarity without possession. It is not a feeling and not an argument. It is the quiet recognition that truth is self-evident when nothing distorts it. In this recognition, the idea of my understanding dissolves. There is only understanding. If realization has no owner, who understands? At the end of inquiry, thought recognizes its limits. It sees that it can guide, clarify, and analyze, but it cannot grasp truth through force. When thought stops trying to secure certainty, stillness emerges. Al-Ghazali suggests that this stillness is not the absence of knowledge but its fulfillment. Truth is no longer pursued. It is present because the mind is no longer interfering with it. In this silence, the distinction between seeker and truth fades. What remains is simple awareness, clear, unclaimed, and unobstructed. If truth reveals itself only when thought becomes silent, what role does thought play in discovering truth?